now we've kind of got all that set up, we can go. Oh, one thing to note is there is that SIFT instructions document at the bottom.
Yeah, so this is really useful actually.
Yeah, I've not updated this for a while actually. I mean, I think if you're watching this video, it should hopefully, well, it will contain a lot more information than the
Yeah, but
document.
it's really useful for sort of reading about what the tool's for and how to install it and everything.
Yeah, I mean, we
If
also
you're
have
watching this
that
video,
publication. Yeah, we have that publication in Science of the Total Environment on this as well.
yeah, that's also really useful. I remember that.
Yeah, it's
Excellent.
important to note as well, I guess, there's that SIFT isn't the only tool that does this stuff. There's lots of other models that people use. I know the USGS has got quite a nice one. I think it's called SEDStat. And actually, they did help me with some of the code for the mixing model on this one, so it's worth shouting out to those. And I know I have read a few papers where people have used that tool very successfully and published some nice research from it. So it's worth checking that out as well. So if you go back to the R program we've got open. Cool, yeah, and run app. Right, so we're actually ready to start running all this tool now and doing our fingerprinting. Okay, so if you click the button where it says blue at the top there, that lets you select the different colors to make the graphs in the software, and you can actually go back and change this as you're going through. It's not an important one, but it's kind of, I've tried to make it so rather than having to make your own graphs to put in a publication or a report or a thesis, you can actually just right click and copy and paste the graphs that the software produces.
Handy.
Yeah, it saves huge amounts of time. I'm really bad at kind of arty stuff, so it's good to like just be able to copy them. You've also got, you see the red, blue, green, yellow boxes at the bottom. That also lets you change colours for specific sources on maps and charts and things like that.
You're really specific there too, look.
Yeah, so as long as the colours are different enough, you can change them. Mentioning maps, it does remind me of one thing we forgot. This software does let you upload a map of your catchment, and it will produce you nice maps of all the sediment sources and tracer properties of the source samples you've got, which is why you kind of write in the X and Y coordinates on that input sheet. So I'll show you how to do that. If you click back to the SIFT folder we had originally, and you see there's a GIS inputs folder. Right, there's a file in there that won't let you open it or anything, but in here you'll put a file that's called map.tiff. Importantly, it must be named map.tiff. You can't call it anything else, and it has to be a georeferenced TIFF file with the same coordinate system as your X and Y measurements you typed in the input sheet. So in this case it would be British National Grid, but if you use decimal degrees you can use say WGS 1984. I don't know about different pieces of software, but if you want to produce this in ArcMap, what you do is make your nice map in Arc. If you go to data frame properties, I think it's under tools and data frame properties, you can check it's got the coordinate system for the map set correctly, which it should be in most of the time if you've gone and made the map to be working. Once that's set, you'll just go File, Export Map, and there's an option there and you can select the file format and call it TIFF or .tiff. And there's a box somewhere there and it will say kind of keep georeferencing information or geotags or something like that. So if you name that file when you export it map.tiff and just copy it into this GIS inputs folder, it should kind of, the software will suck it out of that folder and it should work. I do struggle with bits like that. I find that's kind of the hardest thing to get working, but I know a few people have used this software and put their maps in and it's worked out quite nicely. So if you follow those
that's really good.
it should work.
Yeah.
You will find though it's best to keep the map kind of quite simple because it does scale down the resolution in the software. You just find like I can make it come up with these really nice high detailed maps, but it takes so long to load all the data, and process all the maps. It's just not worth it. So I
Yeah.
keep them quite low resolution. And another thing to mention is I'll show you the map when we run the software, but it's also worth, if you've got sediment samples, perhaps drawing some arrows in and marking on the map where each sediment sample was taken from, just because the software hasn't got built in to actually plot the sediment samples itself. We'll see later how I did that. Okay, so if you switch back to R and the app we've got running. Okay, so the last thing to look at on here is you've got this mean tracer measurement error slider. I've set it at 0 as a default. And it's quite important to include this. So, I mean, I think one update I might do in the future is let you type in your own individual measurement error for each sample. I mean, the way I've kind of worked this out before is when you're doing the analysis, if you take 5 or so samples and repeat analyze them, you can kind of work out an average and a coefficient of variation for the measurements between all the repeats, and it will give you a certain percentage there, and you can move your slider to that specific value. Yeah, this data set's quite hard because we've got things like magnetic measurements where the measurement error is quite low, about 1%. And you've got stuff like geochemistry, and depending on how good you are in ICP, it could be up to kind of 15, 20%. Yeah, it's very high.
Yeah.
Depending on the elements as well and their concentrations. So, I mean, let's set it at, say for this example, let's set it at 5%. Yeah, cool. So once that's set, I mean, I won't go into too much details now, but all that'll do is when you're running in a mixing model, it will vary your tracer concentration value you're inputting into a mixing model by 5% either side of the mean. It takes into account the uncertainty associated with that measurement error in the end results, rather than just saying there's no measurement error. So once this is all set up and we've got all our packages working properly, we can click the start button.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, it pops up with that little box, but I mean, probably best to close that. Yeah, and if you close both of them, I do need to figure out a way to get those boxes to stop coming up. The reason to have them is if it detects a problem with the data, it will flash up with a pop-up message telling you.
Okay, so it's quite handy, but if there's no issues, you don't really.
Okay, so on this screen, you see we've got a nice table, and it's got our sample, so our sediment sample in the first column, like T1, T2, and things like that. Then it's got all of our tracers up on that top row. And what it's doing here is just running through each sample and checking, is the value for that tracer we've measured falling within the range of values we've measured for our source samples. So imagine if we had something like one of our samples, say like Dodford for example, as it stands it all says true, 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 which is good. It means the values we've measured for those tracers fall within the range of the source samples. But if, for example, we had a sediment sample and half of them were coming out saying false, it means our values are either way higher than we're getting in our sources or way lower. And it kind of tells us there's probably something wrong with that sample. So one reason that could be, and I mean, one problem I've had before in certain rivers is, say, if you collect a sample of sediment from the riverbed, it might be there might be a thick sediment deposit there. It might be like very anoxic or something like that. And you can get, in those conditions, you can get all the iron and various soluble elements would leach out of the sediment. And you can often tell when you sample it because it stinks, and it's could be like a bluey colour, could be very black or something like that. You just end up with a sediment sample that's been so altered while it's been in the river that it has no resemblance to its sources anymore. And rather than run through all the methodology with this dodgy sediment sampling, this screen gives you an opportunity to remove it. So if you scroll down, slightly. I mean, all the traces here are fine in this data set,
Yeah.
but for example, say this Dodford sample, we were getting lots of falses. Like you've just done, yeah, we'd tick that box there, and that would tell the model to delete that sediment sample. So we're no longer going to work with that one.
Yeah.
Because leaving that in can cause problems later on, especially if you're doing something like a range test, which we'll get onto, where we're seeing it. We are actually seeing if those values for the sediment sample fall within the range of its sources a bit more strictly. And there we're looking at individual tracers and seeing if we've perhaps got a tracer that's dodgy rather than a sediment sample. And if we have a dodgy sediment sample in there, it's going to mess up that analysis. Cool. So one thing to mention here is you see on that top row of the SIFT software, we've got all these tabs. Don't click any, but it's important to remember here what we can do is click back to look at previous tabs. So if you click the setup tab, we can go back and look at what we did there. And if you go to the sediment samples tab, we can look at that. But what you can't do is click forward. So if you were to click one of the other tabs, it will try and load the plots and things before we've actually got the data for it.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it won't cause a crash, but what it will mean is when we actually get to that tab, it's already tried to load the data and failed, so the graphs and things might not come out properly. But quite often you might want to click back along these tabs and look as you're working through it.
Yeah.
And we'll do that as we're going. Okay, so if you click the next button, we can go to source group classification. Okay, so this is, I think, probably one of the most, or if not the most important screen in the software.
Yeah.
And it's something quite a lot of published papers don't consider. It's, as we mentioned, what we'll do when we're doing this fingerprinting exercise is walk out within our catchment, collecting samples of all these different sediment sources. And I said we've got a land use and a geology column in that input sheet. And you can see the headers are kind of mirrored there as well. And what we'll do is, say in this example from the Nen Basin, for land use, we've collected urban street dust, cultivated topsoils, grassland topsoils and channel banks. And I mean, ideally, we'd love to do the fingerprinting with all those as separate sources and get like a percentage contribution from each. But unfortunately, what you find is in real life, often all the tracer properties you've measured just can't accurately tell those four sources apart. And in this case, that's what's happened. So the model, what it's done is run a linear discriminant analysis just using all our data set. And we just want to get an idea of have the properties we've measured, are they actually able to tell those sediment sources apart? So what we're looking at on the plots here, you can see we've got two discriminant functions that the discriminant analysis has produced. And the percentage of the overall discrimination is in brackets after each one. So we can see this function 1 is like 98.5% of our discrimination. So, and what you can see is that along that axis, we've got a really good separation of our urban street dusts from all of our kind of soil and channel bank samples. So that's really good, exactly what we want to see. We want to see the source groups as far apart as possible and not really any overlap between them.
So limestone's quite good as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that works well there.
Limestone and urban.
Yeah, so limestone's full of kind of calcium and stuff, which sets that apart, and the urban source is full of all sorts of tracers. So there'll be,
yeah,
there'll be more magnetic. They'll have things like lead and zinc and stuff in them. They'll have loads of lead-210, the fallout radionuclide. But you can kind of see where we've got like cultivated grassland and channel banks. They're really overlapping a lot, and the discrimination is like it's like 1% of the total discrimination, which might not be bad. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean we can't discriminate between them, but it does strongly look that way.
Yeah.
So if you scroll down slightly, let's just look at land use for now. See, we've got this table here, the confusion matrix. and it's saying what percentage of the source samples we've collected for each group can be correctly classified into their respective groups. So for urban, you can see the way to read this is like diagonally from the top left, I think, to the bottom right.
So urban.
Yeah, so 100%, like all of
Cultivated.
those. Yeah.
So yeah, even cultivated is quite high on here.
Yeah, but if you look at the, say, grassland and channel banks, you can see they're quite low, and lots of the grassland and channel bank samples are getting misclassified into the cultivated group. So you see you've got that 26.0% of the grassland samples it thinks would be cultivated, and 34% of the channel banks.
Yeah.
So it does kind of tell us we're not able to discriminate between those sources.
No.
So what we're going to want to do is reclassify those sources to combine some of the source groups together. So we actually have fewer source groups, but that can be discriminated apart. So if you scroll down a bit, just to here. So we've got these sets of buttons here, and what it's got along the top, it's got these 4 columns, so it lets you have a maximum of 4 different source groups. And I've kind of tried to program this so it puts what it thinks the best source groups are. That's not the easiest thing to program, so it's not that good at telling, but some data sets it works well, others it doesn't. But you can see what the model thinks you should have as your source groups is like land use new source 1 should be the urban source because that's very strongly discriminated, and source 2 should be cultivated grasslands and channel banks all combined into a single group.
But should we put grassland and channel banks as one?
Yeah, you could do it. I mean, you could either have cultivated and grasslands together, or you could perhaps do it as you have done. Just depends how you want to do it. I mean, cool. Okay, if you go back to the top, I mean, let's just double check the plot. So channel banks and grassland. So no, we're going to want. So if we look, the green channel grassland samples are quite high.
Yeah.
And that the yellow channel banks are quite low.
So actually, you want channel banks and then cultivated and grassland.
Yeah, perfect.
Like that. Yeah, because you see where the overlap is.
Yeah. I mean, it may be we still can't discriminate those very well, but
no.
But at least it's a lot more realistic than doing all 4.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, you know, when you look at the table too, you can see where the differences are. So.
Yeah, perfect. So do you want to do the? Do you want to do the urban one? Not urban, the geology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a bit harder because you see we've got loads of source groups we're starting with.
So urban is clearly one on its own.
Yeah.
And limestone.
Yeah.
And potentially ironstone. No, I don't know. I think they all overlap a lot, don't they? Let's look in here. So so mudstone is quite high, but then when you look on here, they have an awful lot of overlap still. So I put urban as 1, and then limestone as 1, and then would you put? Yeah, I'd put maybe ironstone as 1.
When I've done this in the past, I'm always not sure. Ironstone's a borderline case, but I mean, it's worth trying it with that as a separate one.
But then everything else, I think, needs to just go together, doesn't it, really?
Because so you notice at the top, you've got that red warning thing.
Diamecton. Yeah. Is that... Yeah?
No, so if you go to the top of the page, this is one thing I added in recently. So if you haven't got all of your sources in a group, it will come up with this red line warning message.
Oh, yeah.
So you're missing a source group, or you've got a source group in 2 columns or something like that. So if you go back down to the tick boxes, there's probably just mudstone, I think you're missing.
There you go.
Yeah, limestone.
Yeah, that's all of them now.
Cool, yeah, so if you go to the top, perfect, the red line's gone, so that means you're safe.
That's handy. So you know if you missed one.
So at the bottom here, it's you can actually name these source groups you've come up with. By default, it will name them. It'll name them just with the first 3 letters of what the source is. But you can change these. I mean, it's worth keeping these quite short because it just kind of, in some of the later graphs, it will like what's the word? It will kind of squash the graph to fit in the legend. Yeah.
Not sure what to call this one because it's got loads.
I normally call it clays because all of those. Well, I
They're
guess
all
sand
clay.
isn't clay, but
Yeah.
they're not ironstone and limestone. Your grassland, you might want to call it topsoil or something like that, or soil. Maybe soil to keep it short.
Just soil. Okay.
Yeah, it's cultivated in grassland.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you go to the top when you're happy with that and click the button, yeah. Perfect, so we've gone from having all those different source groups we couldn't discriminate to we've got 3 for land use and 4 for geology, which we actually stand a reasonable-ish chance of discriminating. And you can see it's replotted those biplots we had in the last screen, but with our new source groups. And you see they do look a lot better separated than before. So we'll start at the top before looking at some others. What this screen does, it goes through all the source samples we have and looks and thinks, does it think we've perhaps classified some of them into the wrong source group? So land use, there's nothing really in that one. We won't look at that so much, but geology, let's take a look at. And you can see what it's done is color-coded the points by the source group we've assigned it to, like the red is urban. But where it thinks the source group might be classified into the wrong source group, it's put its name there, and the name is coloured by the source group it thinks the sample should be in.
Yeah, I see. Quite a few days here have been.
Yeah, so I mean, land use, you can see there's loads of like names there, but that's simply because our discrimination's not very good, so there are just lots of overlap. But geology is a bit more different because you see the limestone sources are quite separate down there at the bottom. But we've got some black points in there from the clays groups, which it thinks should be limestone soils. So it's like SYCB5, NUST-CB. Sometimes it can be hard to read them. So, I mean, what we don't want to do is just go through and reclassify anything that we think that the model thinks is in the wrong source. It could be like with the land use one, we've got a lot of variability in the properties within that source, and they just kind of overlap, and a lot of it is just natural variation.
Yeah.
So if we were to go and reclassify them all, we're going to come up with this result that looks brilliant, but it doesn't have much resemblance of what's actually going on in the catchment.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we can do is go down and so if you scroll down slightly, you can see this is where we were talking about putting the map in that GIS inputs folder. It starts to come in useful because it plots us a nice map here of our catchment. Color coding each point is a sample we've collected from a sediment source, and it's color coded it by the group it's in. And again, it's kind of where it's thinks the sample's in the wrong group, it's labeled it with the sample name in the color of the group it should be in. So you can see on this map I've kind of put in just quite a simple outline of the catchment with the rivers, and I've highlighted urban areas in red, in the grey.
Yeah.
In red we've got ironstone topsoils, which are very orange in the catchment, you can tell them apart quite easily. And in the yellowy orange colour is the limestone. And it's interesting, if you scroll up slightly, what you see here is in the blue samples you've got all these misclassified samples which it thinks should be limestone, and you'll find they're all kind of right in the east side of the catchment, and the map's orientated to the north, and you can see the sample names kind of match up there, so they're all in green on the right. Can't see if my cursor works. I don't know if people are able to see it, but I've kind of put my cursor in the region. Yeah, you've got it as well. It's where your cursor is there. And you can see a lot of those samples are called CB. So Welly CB4, Ecton CB1. And that means they're channel bank samples. And what we've classified them as has been in the white kind of clayey, non-ironstony or limestoney topsoils. But the model thinks they should be limestone. And the reason for that is that the geology at the, say, half a metre down the channel bank is different to the geology on the top of the channel bank. So you've actually got a vein of limestoney derived soil making up the channel bank, whereas the stuff on the top is just from glacial diamicton. So in this case, hope you understand why it is actually worth reclassifying that and changing these from being clays to actually being limestone. Because what we've sampled is limestone. It just isn't reflected on the geology map accurately. Sorry, I should say before we were kind of looking up at the that was the
land use map.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so that's why we couldn't see it so clearly. But here you can
that's
see
the land use map, and then you also have your geology map.
Yeah,
and here you can see it far more clearly.
Yeah, that's right. So all those blue ones there are where it thinks it should be limestone.
These three.
Yeah, so what we want to do is reclassify those and say that we've actually called them the wrong geology when we sampled them, so we're going to change them to actually be limestone. And I think it's important to only go and do that reclassification if you can provide a very robust reason why, which in this case we can. We just don't want to go and reclassify anything that it thinks is wrong, because we'll end up with a nice result which isn't representative.
Yeah.
So if you scroll down slightly, you can see here we've got land use on the one side, which we're kind of leaving alone, and we've got geology on the other. And you've got all these little checkbox buttons on the right side in this reclassify one. So what we need to do is find all the ones that are it thinks are misclassified limestone in this side of the map and reclassify them.
Yeah. So for example, with NUS CB and CB1.
Yeah. So I've worked with this data set a lot, so I can probably tell you which ones from memory. So if you do Welly CB4,
NUS CB,
Welly CB4 just below the HIN CB1.
Yeah.
Ecton CB1 at the bottom.
Yeah.
Let's think. I think there was a. Let's see, Welly less than HIN. Have we got Welly CB4 and HIN CB1? Yeah, we have.
Yeah. So those four.
No memory after Christmas.
So those four are going to be reclassified according to what the model thinks. But you can see that it's representative.
Oh no, we haven't. My memory is terrible.
Yeah, we've got Ecton. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. I think it was only four.
Yeah, if you go back up to the top on that first pie plot, and let's do SYCB5.
SYCB5. There we go. Perfect.
Yeah. So another thing, if you go right back to the top, we don't need to do it in this data set, but let's imagine, say, on these biplots, if you had, say, a green point which was kind of right off in the middle of nowhere, just way away from any other source group, or totally, say it was off in the urban source group and we couldn't explain why. Because if we've got any really dodgy values, you'd go back and instead of ticking the box in that reclassify column, you'd click it in the delete one, and that would delete that sample. Yeah. So we don't want to go crazy with that. It's only if anything's looking really dodgy we might want to remove it. But it just gives us a chance to kind of tidy up our data set, and any mistakes we might have made during our sampling and things we can fix here.
Yeah.
Okay, so once we're happy with that, you can click that Accept Source Groups button. Okay, so now we've done this, we go on to this next stage.
Yeah.
And you can see that what this has done is for each of our source groups, It's calculated like the mean value and the median absolute deviation, which is like a kind of robust version of a standard deviation. So how much the tracer values vary within the source group. So if you go to, let's change it and go to, you see there's a drop down menu at the top that says to cluster. We'll explain why that is later. But if you go to, say, geology, it's probably the best one.
Yeah.
See, in median, it's got our source groups, and it's got, say, urban, limestone, ironstone, and our clays. So if you have a look at the tracer concentrations, you've got things like the KLF, the first column, is very high in urban source group. So it's kind of saying the urban sources are much more have a higher magnetic susceptibility than the other sources. If you look at calcium there, you can see it's much higher in the limestone group, as you'd expect. And you've got arsenic there, is much higher in the ironstone source group. So we don't actually really need to do anything with this data, but it's kind of presented in case a user wants to kind of look through it. But what we do want to look at is this mean variability ratio and max variability ratio column. And what this is the ratio of the kind of within source group variability, so how spread out the values for each tracer are within a source group, compared to the differences between the source groups. So what we really want is like very large differences in tracer concentrations between the source groups and a very low variation within that source group. So they're very different. All the sources are very different, but the samples in the source groups are all kind of roughly the same. I mean, you'll never actually get that. But what the ratio shows is that if it's below 1, it means that within source group variability is much higher than the differences between source groups. And if you run a mixing model with a tracer like that, you'll find your uncertainty ranges in your end graphs are really big, just because they're related to that, how well the source groups can discriminate in that way. So what it does is it calculates that variability ratio for pairs of the source groups, like ironstone against limestone, ironstone against clays, and every combination of them. And the mean variability ratio will be the mean for all the source groups. And sometimes I find that actually looking at this doesn't really add anything to your end results and make them a lot better, but other times you'll find it actually can make quite a big difference. So what we can see is, you see there's that yellow slider there. It's saying like minimum mean variability ratio for all pairs of sources.
Yeah.
If you increase that to, say, 5 or 6 or something, you'll see that column you're pointing at will change, and it will say any tracer values which are kind of falling outside of that won't be analysed by the software.
Yeah.
So we're saying that the variability ratio has to be above 5 in this mean variability ratio column.
Yeah.
What we'll do this time, we'll leave it on 1 because I don't think we really need to exclude anything. But if, for example, you run the software first time and you find your end results have these huge error bars associated with them, it might be worth increasing this slider to start to exclude some of the tracers.
Yeah.
And we've got that as well. We've also got that maximum variability ratio column, and that's the highest variability ratio between two sources. Just looking at that, you can see the value for aluminium is 1.8 in that top table. That's a very low one compared to the others, where we've got calcium as like 45 and cobalt.
Yeah.
That's quite low, 3. So I mean, there's an argument to be made to perhaps increasing it to 2, maybe increase the red slider to 2 or more. We'll get rid of aluminium. So
aluminium's gone. Yeah,
you see it's gone to false at the bottom, and at the bottom one there, it gives you an overall summary of which tracers have passed and failed. So we've just changed this for the geology group, and you can see you've got this nice table at the bottom, and it just summarises what settings you've set for each source group, so you don't have to remember, because it doesn't kind of keep the sliders where they are. So geology, we've got required mean of 1 and required max of 2. So it's got a note for that for when you write up this work. So if you go back to the top, we won't bother looking at land use. Actually, we will. Let's have a quick look. What we should see here is much, much lower values than for geology. So if you go down to the variability ratios, up a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, they're not too bad, but you can see things like arsenic, 0.72.
Yeah, it's really low. And
0.6.
0.67.
Yeah, I mean, the reason for that is, we've got urban in there, which is very different properties to like the channel banks and topsoils, but the topsoils and channel banks would have very similar tracer values, so that variability ratio is going to be quite low. I mean, one tracer there that actually has a good variability ratio is the cesium-137, because we'd expect that to be very high in values in topsoils but very low values in channel banks, because it's a fallout radionuclide. So it's created by high altitude nuclear weapons tests and things like Chernobyl, and falling down onto the soil surface.
So magnetic ones are good as well, aren't they?
Yeah, so that's likely what you do find is the magnetics tend to be a bit higher in topsoils when compared to channel banks.
It's deeper.
Yeah, you get various soil bacteria and things like that, which will create microscopic kind of iron oxide grains, which are magnetic. And in channel banks, you often get them, they're quite saturated and wet, and a lot of the iron, because it's kind of anoxic reducing conditions, will dissolve and leach away. So you lose some magnetism there. But most of that's going to be because those urban soils are very, very magnetic, and all of other ones aren't. Cool, so if you go back to the top, one thing you'll notice is in the drop-down menu, you've got some more source groups. So it's got a 2 cluster, 3 cluster and 4 cluster source group. And what the model has done here is, in addition to our land use and geology we set it up with, and which most people would use, it's taken our tracer data set we've measured for our source samples and run a hierarchical, I think it's a 2-step cluster analysis it's run using that. And we've told it to select what it thinks are the 2 best ways of separating the data, or grouping the source group data, to achieve the maximum discrimination between the source groups. Not many people really use these. I think it was first done around 1993, and it was Des Walling and Jamie Woodward, amongst others, used this, and then it kind of got forgotten for many years. And we'll kind of talk through as we get onto some later stages as why it's particularly good to use these. But the fundamental reasons are that, firstly, we can get it to group our sources by using the tracer data, which we can compare to our land use and geology sources and see if they're the same. Because if they are the same, it means our classification of the source groups is probably the best it's going to be. If it's kind of classified our sources totally differently, it means perhaps there's a stronger control on the tracers we've measured than land use or geology. And we've not accounted for that, and we probably need to consider that, because it's going to have a big effect on our results and how accurate they are. Second reason is, and unfortunately, like a lot of people, there's a lot of published research that kind of doesn't take this fully into account. It's sometimes, if you start off with these land use and geology source groups, it's just not possible to discriminate them with the tracers you've measured. And if you spent all this time and money processing samples and doing a study, it's very hard to admit that it just hasn't worked. And like you do, it's getting a lot less common now, fortunately, but you do see that some papers published where it's very clear you can't discriminate the sources well, but you just don't want to throw away all that research because it's not working. So you can just run the unmixing model and get a result which probably isn't going to be reliable. But if you do use cluster analysis source groups, it gives you another way of classifying sediment sources within your catchment that will work, because you're using the tracer data to actually classify the source groups. It's always going to be very good discrimination between them, so you're going to get a very good result. And it's just like, I guess it just comes down to whether these cluster groups actually mean anything in the context of a catchment. And we'll talk about it when we get to the maps page, but it has a lot of advantages, I think. And you'll see as we go through certain ways we'll use these to help us understand what's going on in the catchment. Okay, so once we're happy with these, I mean, we can go through on the drop-down menu and look at each. I mean, sometimes I'll do it, look at each individually and adjust those tracer variability ratio sliders. But I mean, we won't do it this time. I think first run through, I tend to just have a brief glance and really leave them as they are. It's just if we run it the first time and we're not happy with our result, we can come back and change these. So if you click continue, we'll move on.